Good morning. I think we are ready to start now. And we're going to start with Professor Isabel Ferreira Nunes, Director of National Defense Institute.
So, good morning. In my capacity as Director of the National Defense Institute, it's my pleasure to welcome you to this seminar on NATO after the Hague Summit, Deterring and Defending for the Future, organized by the National Defense Institute. With the help of 7 of our best European researchers, we will unfold the way ahead for Euro-Atlantic defense after the Hague Summit. And last week, summit was held in a Euro-Atlantic context of pledges to annually commit 5% of GDP on core defense requirements, as well as defense and security-related spending. Deterrence and collective defense remain, of course, 2 of NATO's core tasks. Lawrence Friedman, on his book Deterrence, defines this concept as a technique, a doctrine, but also a state of mind. So it means it has material and non-material aspects that outline the limits of intentions and actions among contenders. And this means that deterrence regards having the capabilities, but also the will to use them in order to achieve a given strategic objective. The internationalization of security challenges due to the growing interdependence, also due to the prevalence of competing economic interests and new technological developments in the conduct of warfare, will shape how the West collectively will deter and defend. This will comprehend capabilities other than military ones, being resilience, innovation, and economic and technological leverage part of a whole of society approach to this new Euro-Atlantic defense, from core defense requirements to the protection of our infrastructures, our networks, and the development of a defense industrial base. As endorsed by NATO's Rapid Adoption Action Plan, with an overall time horizon of 24 months to commit, the allies will have to focus on critical shortfalls, as well as develop new defense technologies and products and explore new ways on how to foster a new defense business model. And this is expected to speed the planning cycle from identifying priorities and needs, and at the same time to develop, acquire, and integrate new technologies within the alliance. NATO summit main topic, as we all know, evolved around compliance with the defense spending, 5% until 2035, but the challenge that lays ahead is how allies will find the right way to nationally finance defense spending, keeping public debt stable and national budgetary balance on track, while ensuring welfare state standards. It is important to remind that since the beginning of war in Ukraine, the average expenditure of defense by European allies and Canada increased from a percentage of 1.7% of GDP to 2% in 2024, and that 22% of the allies' acquisitions were purchased in the American defense market. In 2025, the majority of the allies are expected to meet and even exceed the threshold of 2%. Of course, after the summit, an array of issues persist. The absence of remarks to Ukraine's accession to NATO, replaced by a mere acknowledgement of continued support to Ukraine and the inclusion of this support for Ukraine's defense when calculating allies' defense spending. Also, the existence of a very tight timeline to meet the 5% GDP spending on defense that allies have effectively to reach. Also, the continuous focus on prioritizing NATO's north and east peripheries as compared to the south, regardless the deterioration of the security context in the Sahel and in the Middle East. And finally, the need to align defense capability priorities within NATO and the EU, and the imperative to harmonize defense planning, capability development, and industrial and technological development among the 23 NATO allies, which are also EU member states. So these are just a few of the challenges that remain after the Hague Summit. NATO's strategic relevance will definitely depend not only on its actual force posture and capabilities, but also on its ability to adapt, to show willingness to employ its deterrence capabilities, and how this intention is perceived by opponents. And this last feature, it's a very important feature. Therefore, political will, public support, and the existence of able and willing security providers to deter and defend will contribute significantly to increase investments in capabilities, in defense technologies and industries. And it's this sum of wills and strengths that ultimately reinforce collective action to ensure the protection of our values and the freedom of our democracies. With this, we invite our 7 guest speakers and 2 moderators, to whom I would like to express our highest appreciation for your contribution to this webinar, and to our guest audience for joining us in this reflection on the challenges that lay ahead for deterrence and defense in the Euro-Atlantic context. To all, I wish you an excellent conference and very, very productive debate. Thank you. Colonel Legeniu, I hand over the floor to you.
Good morning, esteemed colleagues and distinguished guests. The Hague summit last week was notably marked by the prominence of number 5. A concise 5-point declaration was issued, beginning with a reaffirmation of the Allied commitment to Article 5. It also included an agreement to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP per annum within the next 10 years, and highlighted 5 key priorities for NATO as identified by Chatham House. 1, continued support for Ukraine. 2, ongoing review of NATO's strategic approach to Russia. 3, preparation for a potential reduction of US presence in Europe. 4, the imperative to build industrial capacity. And 5, engagement with the Indo-Pacific to counterbalance China's influence. It is therefore both timely and an honor to moderate this first panel focused on NATO's readiness and how the allies are strengthening their defenses in response to these evolving strategic challenges. NATO is steadfast in reaffirming its commitment to deterrence and collective defense, as Professor Isabel Ferreira Nunes told us. However, this commitment demands constant adaptation. The threats we face today are not solely conventional, they are increasingly cyber, technological, and asymmetric, often directed at our critical infrastructure, digital ecosystems, and strategic decision-making processes. This panel will address 3 pivotal areas that are shaping NATO's ability to respond and adapt: the protection of critical infrastructure, the digital transformation of the alliance, and the technological evolution of modern warfare. We are privileged to be joined by distinguished speakers who will offer valuable insights into how NATO and its allies are preparing to remain agile, credible, and resilient in this complex and dynamic security environment. Following the presentations, we will open the floor to questions, and I kindly ask you to submit your questions via the chat box addressed to the moderator, and I will convey them to our guest speakers. For the first talk on critical infrastructure protection, and joining us from Rome, I welcome Alberto Rizzi. Alberto Rizzi is a policy fellow at the European Council of Foreign Relations, based in Rome office. Previously, he was a pan-European fellow and a visiting fellow with the European Power Program at ECFR. Rizzi works mainly in geoeconomics, with his research interests focusing on European economic policies, international trade, and the geopolitics of energy and infrastructure. He also covers the European Union's economic engagement with developing countries and connecting initiatives. Rizzi is also a frequent commentator on international affairs for several Italian and international media outlets. Alberto, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. I'm really honored to be part of this webinar, and I kindly thank you for your invitation. I also do slightly apologize for the state of my voice, but apparently attending a Bruce Springsteen concert last night, not a lot of strategic planning if you have to give a webinar on the day after. But strategic planning is indeed what Europe needs to tackle, and NATO as well, to tackle the challenges that are affecting undersea infrastructure, and with particular regard undersea cables as well as energy interconnectors and pipelines. And it is an absolute necessity, especially because the importance of these critical infrastructures cannot be overstated. They are absolutely essential to the functioning of our socioeconomic lives. Pretty much everything that revolves around our economics, strategic communications, daily lives depend on having a secure critical infrastructure in the undersea domain, and in special regard if we look at the data cables that provide the European connectivity with the rest of the world. And Europe is indeed the continent that has the highest number of undersea connection, linking it with all the other parts of the continent, and also, that's quite important, linking all Europe's islands of most remote location one with each other, and I would delve into that further. And it is not only the undersea data cables which often feature in the news, but also a huge set of undersea infrastructure that surrounds Europe that provides a key contribution to its energy needs. Just think about the pipelines and the growing set of energy interconnectors that are sprawling up both on in the Baltic and the North Sea, as well as in the Mediterranean. And those are probably the three most significant domain, but there's also the key importance of the North Atlantic gap. In this regard, we have to take into account that the high density and concentration of critical infrastructures in surrounding NATO's water, on the one side, is a testament to our economic strength and independence, but on the other side makes them provides quite a lot of potential targets to malicious actors. And if we consider that 97% of our internet goes through those cables, and any kind of payment that a bank or a firm has to perform likely travels through those cables, or disruptions can be significantly important. And even things that might not come into our mind easily, our transport infrastructure depends on a seamless exchange of data through those cables, as well as a lot of cyber defense as well, but also the very management of our own electricity grid and energy supply. And disruptions in this regard can have kind of a snowball consequence, creating damages that are much more significant. So they're essential to keep us going, but at the same time, they need to be strongly protected. And NATO has shown, on the one side, a growing awareness on a topic that 5 or 10 years ago would have not been even part of the public domain. This is also has happened because we are facing a wave of significant attacks and damages by malicious actors, and the obvious culprit in most cases is Russia. And indeed, the frequency of those attacks has dramatically stepped up after the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And the point is that all those cables especially are extremely weak. They're not much larger than your average garden hose, and they can be cut quite easily in their thinnest parts. It happens by mistake. It can happen with a fishing net dragging on the flow bed, anchors that we have seen in the Baltic several times. And there are three actually dynamics that are impacting the critical infrastructure security of the undersea domain. The first one is definitely the growing weaponization of connectivity and infrastructure as well. We are seeing the extension of political rivalries and competition in all the economic and tech domains, and infrastructure is not is not different from that. And in particular, this rivalry plays out in the construction of the cable, in the decision where the cables should land and which countries should touch, but also in their direct targeting by, as I said, malicious actors. And in this regard, this brings me to the second dynamic, and is the fact that there is a growing threat by malicious rival actors, which include states or non-state actors, and their ability to target economic and civilian infrastructure of the rival power. It's something that in the past was mostly confined to specific situations and probably also in cases where there was an actual conflict going on. But now there is this big gray zone where actors like Russia tend to target enemy infrastructure while maintaining it way below the threshold of a direct attack. Because the damaging of a subsea cable obviously cannot be compared to a military attack, but it can cause significant damages, and this creates significant difficulties in crafting the adequate response because we have not been used, especially on the NATO side, to do this as a part of our strategies, but our enemy is doing that, and we don't always know how we should calibrate the response in terms of deter the attack, but also in terms of making it clear we cannot stand, we will not keep silent and remain the victim of the attacks. And then the third dynamics, which is also quite problematic, is that there's much lower threshold in terms of the technical capabilities that is required to target undersea infrastructure. This is due especially because of technological developments, and underwater drones are still fairly expensive and complicated to build, but they're much cheaper than they used to be years ago. And there is a growing set of experimentation in the different technologies that might be needed. And if we look at oceanic undersea cables, there's very few actors that might have the capability to target them at deep waters, but the Baltic Sea is very shallow, the North Sea is fairly shallow, and a good chunk of the Mediterranean is shallow as well, meaning that a team of specialized divers, small robots that are used in diving activities can be used to actually reach the cables, and when you still reach it, it's fairly easy to tackle them. The Mediterranean situation is slightly more difficult in the sense that the sea is much deeper, but closer to the shore. Cables and small pipelines, as well as energy interconnectors, can still be easily targeted in the areas where they go closer to the shore. The North Atlantic scenario, on the other side, is a different story in the sense that depth of the sea provides a certain degree of protection of the cable, but the problem is that the area is of massive importance for the securing of the northern flank of the alliance, and it provides a strategic gap that Russia has always fought to exploit in order to disrupt also communication and supply lines between the US and Europe. And it's also characterized by a significant presence of remote locations that on the one side play a key role in gathering information, monitoring activities on the flank, but at the same time, for the very reason that they are remote, they rely massively on this kind of undersea connection, and connectivity there, contrary to what we see in the Baltic, for example, is not redundant. There's very few cables, and any disruptions to them would create massive damages to NATO's ability to gather information as well as to craft an adequate response. And beyond that, there's also cables that are used as listening devices, and they have been previously targeted as well. They were mostly used for, of course, research purposes, but at the same time, they had been able to determine the specific wavelengths that certain ships produces, and they have been targeting already in the past. And in a total distance scenario, any Russian attempt to attack the area would probably be preceded by a disruption and cutting off of those cables. And there is a risk, indeed, that Russia is trying to make NATO as much deaf and blind in the area as it can in order to exploit it for strategic purposes. So this brings me to the other side on what Europe should do, and the first one is beyond awareness and strengthening the cooperation with NATO. We also have to take into account that our undersea infrastructure is becoming much more important, not only because we need much more data and capability in connectivity, but also because, as a very consequences of the energy decoupling from Russia, all the strategic infrastructure that lies undersea has become much more important because we are reinforcing the connectivity between Norway and the countries in the Baltic and North Sea area. We are reinforcing different supply lines after the decoupling from Russian gas, and at the same time also in order to increase the resilience of the European electricity grid. There's a growing set of interconnections. Also, the linking of Ukraine plays a role there. And at the same time, with the energy transition, Europe is investing significantly in offshore platforms that also rely on critical undersea infrastructures to be connected to the mainland and provide electricity. And we already know that Russian ships have been mapping the new energy infrastructure around the North Sea, in the Baltic, outside the coast of the Netherlands and the UK, with using submarines and spying ships to target, to map at this time, but potentially in the future also to, of course, to target them, which would create massive dangers in our own energy security at a moment where we are completing this transition. And they're using mainly ships from the so-called shadow fleets, as also used to transport oil in aging tanker under the G7 agreed price line. And those ships provide another layer that makes the difference, the response from the NATO side, quite complicated, because they are not registered in Russia. Obviously, they tend to be registered in third countries. Ownership is dubious, and those, they create this kind of plausible deniability that even if deep down we might know who is the actual responsible, the instigator, it's very difficult to prove those links. Ships have indeed been sanctioned, but many still have not. And one of the critical problem is also that there's a quite significant degree of difference between the list of ships sanctioned by the UK, the one sanctioned by the US, and the one sanctioned by the EU. And this creates loopholes in the sense that certain ships can dock at European ports, but will not be able to do it in the UK. And they are exploiting this lack of significant coordination in this regard. Moving back to the NATO response, the most significant action so far has been clearly the creation of Baltic Sentry and this decision to step up awareness, military presence, and surveillance activities in order to detect attackers before, and also conducting experiments to develop new cost-effective instruments that include maritime drones, but also aerial surveillance, in order to detect and deter potential attackers by massively stepping up the surveillance. We have to take into account, though, that even in a shallow and relatively small sea such as the Baltic, 100% surveillance is not possible. And so the other part is also the deterrence in terms of the response. There are attempts to use environmental and piracy laws to stop up and board suspect ships, and this is helped by the fact that most of those aging tankers don't have proper insurance, and they carry massive environmental risk. And that is also because due to the right of free passage, ships cannot stop until there cannot be stopped unless there are significant reasons in terms of the potential environmental damage they can cause if they have an oil spill, for example. In this regard, it would probably be interesting also to look at how to balance between modifying our legislative procedures in order that deterrence can be enshrined in law and then certain actions can be allowed, and on the one side also giving the adequate weight to the rapid response that probably, even though it's not doesn't carry the same level of legal certainty, it can be more effective in deter. We've seen Finland seizing a ship straight after the potential damage to the cable. So that's one of the significant points, is also trying to find an adequate balance, and also ensuring that there is a good degree of coordination between all the different agencies that are tasked with the security of the waters in the North Sea. We have different responsibilities according to the different countries. And it is becoming more complex now that we have also witnessed Russia even using its own navy vessels to escort the ships through the Baltics and the North Sea, which is an obvious attempt to make any sort of deterrence much more difficult. And my final point here would be dedicated to the boosting of the resilience itself as part of the response, which is also something that has clearly come out from the NATO summit in terms of the defense expenditures that should go to critical infrastructure. So in this regard, build more cables and more interconnection is one of the things to do, because redundancy helps redirecting traffic flows through other cables and makes the single disruption of a cable much less significant. Beyond that, there is room to improve the security, especially of new cables, by burying at least a certain part under concrete and steel reinforced concrete. But this is only possible close to the shore, otherwise it would be extremely expensive and hardly doable on a large scale. Beyond, again, what I said, more coordination, there's also need to improve the reparation and monitoring capabilities, which means having more ships available. There's very little ships actually that are able to perform those critical tasks of repairing the ship in open waters, and that would be extremely important to make sure that whatever disruption comes against NATO countries, it can be easily fixed and repaired. And finally, also moving some of the communication, at least a strategic one, to new tech and especially satellites. But here we have to be very clear. Satellite is not an easy fix. They are much more expensive. They carry only a tiny fraction of the volumes of data that undersea cables transport. So they cannot be the large-scale solution. They're fine if we're talking about remote location, especially as a backup. They're critical importance, and here the IRIS² project is also crucial in overcoming the undersea infrastructure weaknesses, but they should be prioritized in terms of the strategic communication. It's really hard, it's actually impossible, I would say, to see all our critical undersea infrastructure replaced by satellites in a few years, because they still remain much more expensive. And they also, final point, require ground-based infrastructure as well that can still be targeted. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Alberto. It was an excellent talk. I hope we'll have some time to discuss the points you raised. And without further ado, I will introduce our next speaker. She is reaching us from Ghent in Belgium. It's Dr. Raluca Cernatoni. She's a fellow at the Carnegie Europe, working on European security and defense, with a focus on emerging and disruptive technologies like artificial intelligence. At Carnegie Europe, she is also a team leader and senior policy expert on new technologies for the EU-funded project, EU Cyber Diplomacy Initiative, EU Cyber Direct, EUCD. Cernatoni is currently a professor on European security and defense with the Brussels School of Governance and its Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy at Vrije University Brussels in Belgium. At the CSDS, she's a senior research expert on digital technologies in the context of the EU-funded project Indo-Pacific European Hub for Digital Partnership, Trusted Digital Technologies for Sustainable Well-being in PACE. She also co-leads the Flemish Research Council Research Network on Technology, Security, and Conflict. And Dr. Raluca Cernatoni's talk will be on digital NATO. You have the floor, Raluca. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much as well, Colonel Eugenio Antonio, for the kind introduction. It's always kind of daunting to follow a short bio. And also many thanks as well, Professor Nunez, Isabel, for the kind invitation. I'm delighted to join you from a scorching Belgium and Ghent. It's almost 35 degrees here. So my topic as well is very hot at the moment, digital NATO, in the sense that I think that some of the conversations around the digital transformation or the digital revolution revolve around, again, priorities that the Alliance has been identifying for a couple of years now. So in my very brief input remarks, I will focus on NATO's digital readiness, especially in response to evolving cyber threats or evolving threats in cyberspace. Then I will focus on NATO's innovation ecosystem with a focus again on recent initiatives around the topics that already Antonio mentioned that I'm interested in, artificial intelligence, and more recently as well, quantum technologies, especially initiatives spearheaded under Diana and the NATO Innovation Fund. Then I will briefly zoom in on some takeaways from the Hague Summit, especially how the decisions impact the digital initiatives and commitments across the Alliance. And finally, maybe I will, if still some time remains, I will try to sketch out some tasks ahead, especially when it comes to enhancing NATO's digital readiness. So very briefly, when it comes to NATO's digital transformation or digital NATO, in this respect, I do believe that zooming in on the adoption of emerging and disruptive technologies, the so-called EDTs, like artificial intelligence and quantum computing or quantum encryption, are some of the central points to making, again, NATO digitally ready, especially for countering evolving threats in cyberspace. The alliance, I would argue, faces a rapidly changing threat landscape. We have already seen with Mr. Risi's, Alberto's overview, how much that threat landscape is evolving, especially when it comes to critical infrastructure, including connectivity and critical digital infrastructure. And these types of threats range from state-sponsored cyber attacks on indeed this critical digital infrastructure, AI turbocharging disinformation, for instance, but also to broader disruptive effects engendered by emerging and disruptive technologies, especially those that fall in the hands of adversaries. So in response to this, NATO leaders, especially at the 2025 Hague NATO Summit, reinforced their commitment to actually support, bolster cyber defenses, accelerate dual-use innovation and uptake, and also ensure that the alliance maintains its technological edge. So first and foremost, when it comes to evolving threat in cyberspace, I think the 21st century security environment is defined by constant, sophisticated cyber threats, from ransomware attacks on critical infrastructure to state-backed operations targeting military networks. Cyber attacks, I would argue, have become a core element of warfare, including hybrid warfare. And now NATO recognizing cyberspace as a domain of operations and has emphasized that collective defense and deterrence must extend across all domains: land, air, sea, space, under the sea, we have heard as well, and cyber, which again require what I would argue full spectrum types of approaches. So recent conflicts underline these risks. For example, Russia's war against Ukraine has featured cyber assaults and information warfare alongside kinetic operations. So the summit from last week highlighted the need to strengthen digital resilience and cyber resilience against such hybrid threats, including sabotage of infrastructure and digital attacks. There are, of course, some lessons from Ukraine. The Ukraine war demonstrated how rapidly, for instance, commercial digital technologies can be weaponized. Drones were repurposed and AI tools leveraged in weeks, not years. And also, or as already mentioned by Mr. Rizzi, Alberto, Russia's activities are worrying. Russia shortened its military tech development cycles to 2 to 12 weeks during the war. So this is already kind of introducing a rapid pace, this speed, coupled by China's tight integration of its tech industry with its military, the civil military fusion approach, highlight that NATO must adapt quickly or risk falling behind, especially when it comes to these digital transformations. So when it comes to rising cyber attacks over the past decade, NATO members and also NATO agencies have emphasized that government infrastructure, energy grids, healthcare systems, and even space assets need to be protected because attacks against such infrastructures can cripple societies. We have again heard that without actually a single shot fired. So this is really interesting in terms of moving towards a new cyber physical threat landscape in integration. So NATO's cyber defense pledge actually commits allies to strengthen national cyber defenses. But I would argue that collective readiness and collective digital resilience is tested daily. So for these purposes, NATO conducts regular cyber exercises. Just to highlight the lock shields, the world's largest and most complex international live fire cyber exercise, and also, of course, has cyber rapid response teams to assist allies. But I would still argue that the scale and pace of these threats, especially under the AI's impact, AI turbocharging also cybersecurity and cyber defense, this scale and pace demands a greater agility and innovation in NATO's cyber posture. So a digital NATO vision means actually moving beyond just fending off attacks, but towards an agile and anticipatory approach. And the NATO needs to transform into actually a digitally enabled and future-proof and future-oriented alliance. So from this perspective, it's very important to indeed implement the first level digital transformation implementation strategy, a roadmap to modernize NATO's networks, data infrastructure, and of course, processes. And this strategy is very important because it aims to ensure that NATO forces can securely, first of all, communicate, then share data in real time, and that the alliance can harness, again, some of the buzzwords, or at least what I call the emerging and disruptive technologies, but they are not actually buzzwords. They are very important enabling and emerging technological domains. So it's important that the alliance can harness AI, big data, analytics, cloud computing for, of course, better decision making. So in my view, effective digital capabilities are now seen as essential to a digital NATO and, of course, to NATO's core tasks and future successes. And this brings me to the second point, the NATO's innovation ecosystem, especially related to Diana and the NATO Innovation Fund. And I would argue that one of NATO's most significant recent achievements is actually the establishment of an innovation ecosystem to exactly accelerate the adoption, the innovation and adoption development of dual-use emerging and disruptive technologies. The twin kind of pillars of this innovation ecosystems are Diana, Defense Innovation Accelerator for the North Atlantic, and the NATO Innovation Fund. And again, these were both launched to ensure that NATO and its member nations stay at the cutting edge of technology, including digital technologies. I will not go into more details about both initiatives, but it's very important to note that the Diana initiative was established to especially discover and scale dual-use technologies for military applications by actually harnessing the ingenuity of startups, academia, and industry, this triple helix, and also to provide the networks of dozens of accelerator sites and test centers across the North America and Europe, where actually innovators can access funding, mentorship, and military end-user feedback. And I think that from this perspective, the strategic role of Diana, beyond the individual projects already spearheaded, has actually this strategic role has cemented actually NATO's footprint in the broader defense innovation ecosystems. In my view, Diana signals to startups, innovators, entrepreneurs that NATO is open for business with non-traditional also actors in the innovation ecosystem or in the defense innovation ecosystem. So Diana isn't a typical kind of government R&D program. I would argue that the novelty is that it leans on private sector investment and sustainability and not just grants. Complementing Diana, the NATO Innovation Fund is the first multi-sovereign venture capital fund for defense and security. And again, very importantly, it prioritizes early stage deep tech startups, also for digital technologies, and it also operates on venture principles, taking equity stakes in promising companies. And also the idea or the eye is to scale, or the focus is to scale them into future suppliers for allied militaries. So while Diana identifies and nurtures technologies, promising technologies, the Innovation Fund provides the capital to bridge the valley of death for defense startups and other entrepreneurs, helping them actually transition from prototype to product. So together, both initiatives form, I would argue, the core for a digital NATO, especially when it comes to emerging tech initiatives. And again, they were highlighted at the Hague Summit as central to delivering this NATO ambition of faster digital innovation uptake. Again, this is very important because, of course, the proof is in the pudding when it comes to the impact of some of these projects and initiatives. The real impact depends on how well allies will leverage them and follow through with adoption and procurement of new and emerging technologies. This brings me to my third point very briefly. In terms of these emerging and disruptive technologies, harnessing AI and quantum technologies is often mentioned. These two are often cited as the most disruptive, actually, emerging technologies, especially for their ability to augment and replace human decision-making, and the quantum kind of leap for its potential to append, again, computing, encryption, cybersecurity. I will not go into very much details about these two technological domains. I will only mention that, of course, when it comes to the latter, the quantum dimension, there needs to be a very pragmatic approach and also a balancing approach, balancing innovation in this field with caution. I believe that while quantum is exciting, it is not actually a magic wand. Practical military deployment will face engineering challenges, and even once achieved, I will actually argue that quantum tech will require new skills and new doctrines. And this is very important to note. While AI, we need it now, and AI-enabled decision-making, support, logistics, from command and control to battlefield, enabling hardware, autonomous robotics. When it comes to quantum, some pragmatic kind of attitude is needed. Finally, and this is my last point, and very briefly, when it comes to the NATO summit and digital initiatives and commitments, as already actually mentioned by Professor Nunes, the so-called quantum leap in defense investment, allies committed to what has been called quantum leap in defense spending. It's kind of the bridge I was providing with my quantum focus on technologies. Again, this is very important because the 1.5 that can be earmarked for broader security investments, this should prioritize, again, civil preparedness, cyber defense, emerging technologies. In other words, by 2035, these types of fundings should go into things like strengthening, again, critical infrastructure resilience, building cyber capabilities, funding innovation in dual-use technologies. And I think that this is also a strong signal that digital and cyber domains are now considered on par with, for instance, tanks or jets in terms of budgeting priority. So actually for NATO's tech community, this is a promising maybe influx of resources that could mean more funding, also for Diana projects, for instance, and also for national level R&D. This type of priorities, again, aligned with NATO's tech goals. And the other point that I wanted to highlight is the Rapid Adoption Action Plan. Again, the headline goal is to integrate new tech into NATO forces within 24 months of its deployment. So again, it has been recognized that we in the alliance are in what we call a tech race, and the Rapid Adoption Action Plan aims to help NATO bridge the divide, especially when it comes to new tech, again, between the fast-moving tech sector and slower military bureaucracy. And this is a very important point as well in terms of the proof being in the pudding, and really trying to boost NATO's adoption of new technologies and also adapt NATO's own processes to be more agile. Finally, Innovation shouldn't stop at national borders. Again, the idea is to truly create an alliance-wide innovation ecosystem. And if NATO is serious about digital readiness and determined not to be left again behind in the technological race, everything is in place. Prioritization is needed. And I think that NATO's digital readiness is now dependent on implementation. Thank you. Looking forward to the Q&A.
Thank you very much, Raluca. It was a pleasure to hear about this brave new world and the shift needed from hardware to software, and especially in the mindsets. That brings me the next point where the things happen, where implementation actually happens, which will be covered by our next guest speaker, Commodore Rui Marcelo Correia, who is an experienced naval officer with a communications and electronic warfare background. He has been serving in the Portuguese Navy for almost 40 years. During his career, Commodore Marcelo Correia gained a deep expertise in naval operations under national and allied command and control in numerous exercises and operations like NATO Article 5 Operation Active Endeavour and Operation Manatee in the Gulf of Guinea. The highlight of his command at sea goes to the duty of Force Commander of Task Force 465 EU Naval Force Operation Atalanta, which Commodore Marcelo Correia fulfilled in 2022. With a solid NATO education added to the national military preparation, including NATO CIS orientation course, NATO Expeditionary Operations course, and NATO Strategic Planning course, Commodore Correia is currently appointed to the head of Innovation and Transformation Division at the Armed Forces General Staff headquarters in Lisbon since October 2024. You have the floor, Commodore.
Thank you very much. Before I share my presentation, I'd like to express my sincere thanks to the National Defense Institute, notably to Professor Dr. Isabel Nunes. Also, I'd like to commend the Institute for its openness, I would say, and perhaps a bit of sense of adventure in inviting a warfare officer to join a panel of such distinguished academics. Thank you for that. In the same spirit, I'd like to thank the two previous speakers for their presentations, of course, and I can only hope that my contribution will meet the expectations of the audience, knowing already that some topics overlap points discussed by Ms. Raluca. So I'll share my presentation now. I hope that this works. This. I'm not sure that I cannot see yours. Is it feasible to see your screen?
Not that one. You are sharing the screen. You should share the presentation. There we go. All
okay,
set.
Thank you. Now, moving to my presentation. Here's the agenda, of course. I hope it covers all the key points that we want to discuss in our debate. We'll see. Warfare is undergoing a fundamental transformation, as it was already stated by both my colleagues. It's no longer confined to traditional domains like land, sea, and air. Today, the battlefield extends into cyberspace and outer space, with its effects shaping the physical, virtual, and cognitive dimensions. They are not just support functions, they are context arenas where the tactical and the strategic advantage is gained or lost. NATO's readiness must reflect this change. It's not just about physical presence, it's about technological integration, digital superiority, and the ability to operate seamlessly across all domains. This is the essence of multi-domain operations, which have represented a significant challenge in NATO's strategic thinking. With this brief presentation, I will try to explore how NATO and allies are preparing for the technological war of the future, and I try to explore the drivers of change, the most impactful emerging technology already presented by Ms. Reluca, and the response that are shaping NATO's readiness. I think I have a problem here. No. Let's begin with the strategic context. The resurgence of great power competition is pretty evident. Russia's hybrid warfare tactics and China's ambitions in disruptive technologies, notably artificial intelligence and quantum computing, are reshaping the global power dynamics. These actors are not just investing in military hardware. They are investing in technologies that will define the next generation of conflict, some of which are already being used in known conflicts. At the same time, the pace of technological change is accelerating. AI, quantum, biotech, and hypersonic systems are no longer theoretical. They are being tested, deployed, and integrated into the new battle space. A key challenge facing it today is that much of this innovation is emerging outside the traditional defense sector. The private sector and academic institutions have become the principal engines of technological advancement. This results in a civil-military innovation gap that NATO must persist in bridging. Finally, the complexity of modern warfare demands new approaches to command, control, and coordination. Success in future conflicts will depend on the ability to synchronize effects across all domains in real time and often under contested or degraded conditions. Let's now revisit and emphasize some of the key technology areas that are defining NATO's path forward. As you know, AI and systems autonomy are critical for achieving decision superiority. They allow faster, more informed decisions and enable trusted human-machine teaming. AI supports predictive analytics, enhances ISR, and enables autonomous systems to operate in complex environments. Quantum tech are becoming force multipliers, enabling advancing sensing, imaging, precise navigation, submarine detection, and secure communication using quantum-resistant crypto. Biotech and human enhancement technologies are reshaping defense by enabling advanced threat detection, reducing dependencies, and enhancing military performance. They offer innovation in biosensor, synthetic biology, and smart materials for platforms and infrastructure. However, they also pose risks, including bioweapon proliferation and malicious use of technologies. Space, as already said, is now a critical operation domain for NATO, enhancing C2 capabilities, ISR, and navigation, among other things, making it a highly contested environment of high strategic value. However, the increased militarization of and accessibility of space have introduced new threats ranging from jamming and cyber attacks to kinetic anti-satellite weapons. Together, these technologies are not just tools, they are strategic enablers. Mastering these technologies is critical to sustain NATO's readiness and response capabilities. Building on the technologies we have just discussed, let's look at how NATO is organizing itself to stay ahead. The Alliance has been built a robust innovation ecosystem to support technological leadership. At the heart of this is Diana. It connects innovators with defense needs across more than 200 accelerator and sites and test centers, focusing on dual-use technologies and early-stage development support. Complementing this, the NATO Innovation Fund is a 1 billion venture capital fund investing in deep tech startups across the Alliance, making it the world's first defense innovation fund supported by multiple nations. Additionally, we can name more initiatives that contribute to this ecosystem, such as the NATO's Data and AI Review Board, which governs AI used by creating standards, toolkits, and supporting allies' implementation. The NATO Innovation Board, led by Deputy Secretary General, which fosters innovation through external ideas, discussions, and best practices. And the Transatlantic Quantum Community, a flexible network for coordinating quantum research and development efforts. Together with other innovation bodies, this ecosystem ensures that NATO can efficiently move from research to capability at the speed of relevance. Drawing on NATO's innovation ecosystem, the focus is now on how these technologies are being rapidly integrated into operational forces. Speed is a critical requirement. The pace of technological change, especially in the private sector, means that traditional procurement cycles are often too slow to keep up. Recognizing this, the Allied's head of state and government endorsed the NATO's Rapid Adoption Plan last week. This plan sets a bold but essential target: to integrate new technological products into Allied force within 24 months of identifying a capability need. To achieve this, NATO has introduced several key mechanisms, notably including the innovation badges. These are essential NATO seal of approval for emerging technologies. They certify that the product has been tested, vetted, and is ready for operational use. This helps build trust among end users and accelerates procurement decisions. The Task Force X. This is a flexible framework that allows allies to rapidly integrate and deploy new technologies alongside conventional forces. It's designed to be scalable and adaptable across different domains and regions, enabling forward deployed units to experiment and iterate in real-world conditions. Another mechanism is the exploitation of innovation ranges. These are dedicated environments where technologies can be tested under realistic operational scenarios. They support continuous experimentation and help bridge the gap between lab-based development and battlefield application. And finally, the NATO front door for industry. This is a single accessible interface that communicates capability needs to the private sector, enabling NATO and allies to engage with both defense and non-defense industries. It ensures that innovation is demand-driven and aligned with operational priorities. It also helps non-traditional suppliers like startups and academic labs that technologies are integrated quickly, responsibly, and in a way that enhances interoperability across the alliance. But technology alone,
we are losing you. You are in and out. We are hearing you with cuts.
And now,
Now we are 5 by
can
5
you hear
now.
me? Can you hear me now? Cornel.
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay. Continuing, we must also address the ethical, legal, and operational challenges of adaptation. NATO's government framework, including the Data and AI Review Board, seeks to ensure responsible use. But dual-use dilemmas like those in biotech or autonomy require constant vigilance. Interoperability is another challenge, of course. NATO is a multinational alliance. Integrating new technologies across different legal systems, technical standards, and military cultures is complex but essential. And finally, trust. Trust in automation, in data, and in decision-making systems. This trust must be earned through transparency, education, and robust governance and leadership. In conclusion, the technological war of the future is already underway. It is being conducted in labs and in the mind of innovators. NATO's readiness depends not just on adapting to this reality, but on shaping it. NATO must invest in innovation. Allies must collaborate across sectors and borders and adapt faster than competitors and potential adversaries. But as we saw, speed is not enough. NATO's edge lies in its values, in its commitment to responsible innovation, and in its ability to lead not just in capability, but in principle. With this final point, I conclude my presentation, and of course, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Admiral. Thank you for excellent presentation. And now I open the floor for discussions. I invite our guest participants in this webinar to send us your questions through the chat box. Meanwhile, I will have a question for Alberto Rizzi. I would like to ask you, in light of NATO's increasing reliance on digital networks and critical data infrastructure, as you told us, to what extent should the alliance consider the creation of a permanent standing multi-domain task force specifically dedicated to protecting these assets, like the standing naval maritime group that provides some deterrence and presence in the oceans? Should the alliance consider a multi-domain task force for this purpose? What would be the strategic, operational, and political challenges of deploying such a force across allied territories and oceans in the undersea in peacetime?
Thank you. I think it should indeed be under consideration, also because the key element here in boosting defense capability and deterrence is coordination, and it also is not just coordination among different NATO member states, but as you said, also coordination between different domains, because what happens in space affects what happens under the sea, and vice versa. So it's important also to ensure that there is communication between the two parts. In terms of the organization, of course, it would not be a simple task, and it would need to overcome different layers of responsibility and different situation in terms of the responsible authorities, which creates issues in terms of seamless communication, as well as ability to act fast, especially if you have to consult with an excessively large body. But it's important that all those that have a stake in what happens in those domains have a seat and participate to this task force. It would also need to consider the resources that are available, both for human and in terms of maritime assets, as well as other resources that NATO has. And finally, there's obviously the need to overcome political resistance from certain member states, countries that might not be too keen on reneging part of the sovereignty or in sharing certain kind of information. So in NATO, of course, offers a trusted environment to do so, but it has to be conducted, in my view, also with some level of political tact and different nuances according to the challenges.
O Cornel tem que ligar o seu microfone.
Thank you. Thank you. We're starting to have some questions from our audience. But before that, I will ask Raluca Cianatoni to briefly tell us, given the rapid pace and uneven diffusion of emerging and disruptive technologies across the NATO alliance, what are the principal barriers to achieving effective synchronization and interoperability among allies in this domain?
Excellent question. Thank you very much for this question. First and foremost, for me, these would be more cultural gaps, let's call them as such. For me, the strengthening of public-private cooperation is key to move, again, the needle forward when it comes to innovation, especially in this field like emerging and disruptive technologies. NATO cannot innovate alone. It needs the private sector dynamism. So I think that the recurring challenge has been and still is the cultural gap between military procurement and tech startups. So from this perspective, allies should expand, I think, platforms for engagement, more innovation challenges, more hackathons, more sandboxing, again, test before you buy trials. Also, very importantly, I think, is how, for instance, success could be measured when it comes to new tech adoption. Say, as already mentioned, AI decision support tools. The Admiral very much emphasized the importance of AI-enabled decision-making. Or another example would be quantum-resistant communication systems. But actually, again, the success will be measured of how these types of tools should make it from the lab or the startup into a NATO unit level within a very short amount of time. So for this, I think that beyond task force, as you asked the question to Alberto, we need to also think about maybe innovation adoption cells that fast track promising projects, again, empower them to bypass red tape. And this is another important obstacle when it comes to adopting innovation fast, red tape, bureaucracy, and of course, where appropriate. So it's more about a cultural change. So this brings me to my first point, a culture change toward greater risk-taking, flexibility, and speed. And maybe a last point very quickly is maybe the digital skill sets gap. Especially when it comes to operating highly sophisticated technologies. The need is to invest in the human capital, not only in the technology. We often focus on the new and emerging technologies, but modern systems are only as good as the people operating and defending them. I think only about quantum. It's such an esoteric field in the first place. So I think that everyone should ramp up efforts to train and upskill, reskill, and prepare the next generation of fighters.
Thank you very much, Raluca. Right on. We tend to think about technologies at unhuman. So if we introduce the human factor, another picture is revealed. And now I will combine two questions to Commodore Marcelo Correa that I am reading from the chat from Colonel João Barbas. I would like to ask you, since you have the experience of commanding the EU task force, how can NATO and EU gaps be covered with these new technologies, with this new approach, and also from Commandant Elder Zeus addressing the the case for deterrence in cyberspace, if you can, please.
Thank you for the questions. The first one. Now, I think that the time being, NATO is already NATO, both NATO and the EU, of course, are already identifying the gaps, and the big gaps are identified. And I guess as most of the EU members are NATO, they are working together, of course, NATO's and the EU, to try to fill this gap with new techs. One example, and the first question was about that, is how can we protect or defend our underwater critical infrastructure? You might know, and I think that people here in the audience already know that we are experimenting new technologies to monitor and to control the underwater critical infrastructure, because the question was about to engage the standing maritime groups on this protection, and the standing NATO maritime groups are, I would say, too expensive to track the cables and to check, and they time being they don't have this capability. But despite sometimes they embark some new techs, I would say, ROVs and so on and so forth, to do this job. So doing this, identifying new technologies as we are already developing to, for instance, protect and defend our critical infrastructures. Other technologies as the space ones or the manned ones as we are using in the Atalanta, that EU operation in the Indian Ocean. As you know, we use a lot the UAVs there, as NATO is using also. So these gaps, I believe, are covered. Quantum has been talked a lot in this panel, and as far as I know, a lot of allies are developing quantum systems. Here in Portugal, we are already developing some using the industry and also the academia to develop some tools on this quantum. And at the end, I strongly believe that the technology will be the same both for NATO and for EU. The question at the hand is not what can with these technologies what gaps can we fill, but what we need to do is to identify gaps and try to identify new technologies, maybe not invented yet, to fill that gaps. This will be the challenge, of course, because the time being we are using the technologies that we have to fill these gaps. But maybe the question for the private sector, both industry and the academia, is not bring me this quantum technology, being this wavy to fill that gap. No, I want to fill that gap. What can you do to fill that gap with? No, in 10 years we'll have for sure new technologies, and in 10 years we'll have here another panel talking about different technologies or other technologies that we are not discussing now. And I think this fill the first question. The second question, defense and deterrence of the cyberspace. Well, I pity that our commander of our cyber center is not here, but the best deterrence is the protection, of course. So from the moment that you have strong protections, you are somehow doing your deterrence, because the adversary know that the cost to try to, I would say, to hack your system do not compensate. So for me, the best deterrence for the cyberspace is the protection of that space. And that's all.
Thank you, Admiral, for your answers. I would now address a question on how can Europe compete with Russia and China, and how to prepare the armed forces. This question was coming from Professor Sonia Seneca. How can Europe fill the gap about creating military capabilities on these new fields of research and employment of the armed forces? And I'll address this question to Alberto Rizzi.
Thank you very much. I mean, Europe is trying to catch up a bit in certain domains, but at the same time, it still struggles to position itself on the same footing if we consider the main actors. I don't think it's if you look especially at undersea infrastructure and the ability to defend them as well as potentially attack them, because that's the other part of the story. It's not necessarily an issue of capabilities, but more of deciding how to allocate our defense assets, and also about which kind of behavior European countries would like to maintain in case of those thresholds. I still struggle to imagine European countries trying to respond in kind to what Russia is doing in the Baltic Sea, for example. And it's also probably won't serve Europe's interest that much, but there's definitely room to think about how to strengthen capabilities, especially in the space sector, and rapidly boosting our capabilities there. It's not just communication, but also surveillance, and in a more medium to distant term, also the ability to deploy certain assets in low Earth orbit would be absolutely significant. Still, the gap probably also is related to the ability to foster industrial cooperation and innovation in a manner that allows the establishment of significant players that can compete globally with the Chinese or the Americans, but at the same time kind of preserves the ability to rapidly innovate and develop for example, from the startup environment, some significant capabilities. That's somewhere where Europe has still some room to improve.
Thank you very much, Alberto. I will now ask Raluca to briefly address the question about the deterrence in cyberspace.
Thank you very much for the question. I mean, this is something that I actually emphasized in my presentation as well, the fact that there needs to be this full spectrum capability approach when it comes to cyberspace and deterrence. For me, cyberspace has become one of the critical areas, contested areas, when it comes to, again, NATO cyber defense pledge, commitments across allies to strengthen national cyber defenses. And this needs to also emphasize yet again a level playing field between all allies when it comes to digital deterrence. I think digital deterrence or cyber deterrence means moving again beyond just fending off attacks. It's actually transforming across the alliance the entire capabilities to be more digitally resilient. And this starts with digitalization, actually. And also, very importantly, is investment in modernizing NATO's networks, data infrastructures, yet again, processes, investment in talent is very important, and having this instinct of coordination. So I would argue that, again, the key is here interoperability, raising the level playing field and bridging the cyber digital divides across the alliance. And more importantly, and finally, is to really understand the nexuses between AI and cyber, quantum and cyber. So really preparing for the future in terms of post-quantum cryptography. All of these areas need to be, again, future-proofed and tested out, especially when it comes to new ways in which adversaries can use these emerging and disruptive technologies in cyberspace. So I think that maybe instead of deterrence by punishment or denial, I would argue for a form of deterrence through resilience in the digital and cyber domains.
Thank you very much. That's aligned with the Center of Excellence in Hybrid Threats in Helsinki. Now we'll have a closing answer. I mean, a closing question from Professor Isabel Ferreira Nunes to the three speakers. It's about funding. It's about NATO Defense Fund and European Defense Fund. With both funds, will they have a divisive impact on innovation and operational needs prioritization, meaning that EU prioritizes one type of investment and NATO prioritizes a divisive impact on the ID and the use of these technologies? Please be brief. Starting with Alberto.
There is, I would say that there is a risk of having kind of not optimal subdivision of the expenditure, but it's not necessarily a matter of funding, while about the clever way to use the funding in the most cost-effective way. And that means both on the deterrent side as well as in boosting the resilience and strengthening capabilities.
Thank you very much. Raluca?
Yes, I highly agree with this point. I think that I would shift the conversation towards how NATO can leverage partners and other institutional initiatives. I think that NATO's digital resilience, readiness, and preparedness can be amplified by actually working with institutional partners like the European Union, especially when it comes to investing in digital and defense innovation. There are various initiatives now spearheaded by the European Union. So I think that it's more about procedure, again, and processes, and ensuring that NATO and EU efforts are complementary and not duplicate each other. And also, I would add here, beyond the EU institutional focus, NATO should also deepen engagement with tech leading partner nations like Japan, Australia, South Korea, again, with Asia-Pacific partner engagement. And I think that's also very important going forward.
Thank you very much. And Commodore Rea?
Okay, as far as I know, all the allies and also all the EU memberships are waiting for the allies first for this fund boost. But this fund boost will reinforce the allies individually, of course, and later collectively, to reinforce both NATO and the EU. For the moment that you are reinforcing your capability, technologies capability, and so on so far, you are reinforcing both the NATO and also the EU. Collectively speaking, depends on the reinforcement of all the nations involved, of course. And as far as I know, most of the allies already have funding plans for the so-called digital transformation. Not only the NATO one, but nations one, as we have here in Portugal. Just for curiosity, we hope to promulgate our action plan in 2 weeks. This one, the Digital Transformation Action Plan. And of course, we'll take the opportunity of this bazooka to fund our the digital transformation plan. The same is happening with other allies as far as I know. And I think that so for the moment that we are reinforcing your capabilities, you are reinforcing the NATO and also the EU or other organizations that you belong. And that's it.
Thank you, Admiral. I think since basically the decisions remain in nations' capital, it's better for them to have two funds than no fund at all. So they should work together to reinforce their national posture and national investments in order to provide a collective good either for EU or for nations. So this brings me to the closing of this panel, which was outstanding. Thank you very much for our guest speakers that told us about this new world, new investments, a new way of prioritizing the defense and security issues, and to raise the awareness for both the infrastructure and also for the new technologies and also what is expected in the future. So thank you very much for your participation. Hope to see you in some other fora. And also thank you very much for all the participants and our audience. I will recall you that we are going to have a 5-minute break. Please don't go away. We have a second panel, which is also very interesting. Thank you very much. See you next time.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Patricia Dehnhardt. I'm a research advisor here at the National Defense Institute in Lisbon, and it is my pleasure to welcome you all to today's second panel discussion on the outcomes of the NATO summit held in The Hague last week. At the summit, NATO allies agreed on a new force requirement and decided a new defense pledge of 5% of GDP spending, a demand long held by President Trump, who responded by reiterating America's commitment to NATO, and which was reflected in the summit's communique's ironclad commitment to collective defense as enshrined in Article 5 of the Washington Treaty. Despite the sign of relief felt by European allies, significant challenges remain for the future. First, the lack of unity on threat perceptions meant no NATO strategy for Russia was adopted. Russia was merely defined as a long-term threat. Second, US disengagement from support for Ukraine and the Trump administration signaling opposition to Ukraine as a future NATO member means that Ukraine's security is now foremost a European responsibility. Thirdly, the United States will undergo a defense posture review later this year, which will lead to US troop reductions in Europe with potential implications for the use of US strategic enablers by Europeans, which Europeans will struggle to replace when fostering their own defense industrial base. Taken together, the impact of these three challenges mean that Europe can no longer fully rely on US deterrence and defense, and that it urgently needs to develop the necessary capabilities to defend the continent. To help us unpack where NATO stands today and what this means for NATO's deterrence and defense for the future, I'm honored to moderate this conversation with such an insightful group of speakers who will place a particular focus on the strategic priorities of NATO's northeastern and southwestern European allies, regions that, while diverse in geography and history, are united in their commitment to the collective defense and strategic purpose of the alliance. We will also look beyond the Euro-Atlantic area to examine NATO's evolving approach to its global partnerships, in particular the Indo-Pacific Four, and how allies view China and taking into account the interconnectedness between these two regions. Before we begin, and let me apologize for the slight delay and thank you all for being here, and just indicate that for the Q&A session, please write your questions into the chat function, and I will then forward them to our speaker. And our first speaker is Dr. Anna Wieslander, who is Director for Northern Europe at the Atlantic Council and head of the Atlantic Council office in Stockholm. We are very lucky in that she has just come back from the NATO Public Forum at The Hague, where she spoke on the key summit decisions of the summit, and we look forward to hearing about her main takeaways from the summit and how the Nordic countries, and in particular Sweden, are planning to implement NATO's new defense pledge. Anna, I give you the floor. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Patricia, and thanks for the invitation. An honor to speak here today to such a broad audience from all over Europe. Yes, I wanted to take this opportunity to pick up on a few of the things in the very short NATO communique from the Hague summit. I think there were two striking contradictions about this communique and this summit. One was that it was historically brief, the communique, only 5 paragraphs, so perhaps not that much to dwell upon to some extent, but on the other hand, a historic shift for
the allies with the pledge of spending 5% on defense, and also what that will mean, as you said in your introduction, for European allies. This is really that NATO is entering a new era, and this much bespoken European pillar of NATO, the more Europe NATO, will, I think, definitely emerge if this road is followed upon, and which we need to do. We'll come back a bit to what I think is necessary ahead, but I just wanted to take this opportunity also to say a few words on what is very important from a Northern European perspective. And in this communique, it is interesting, and this was a bit of a positive thing for me when I read it, is that Russia is actually not only mentioned, but mentioned as a long-term threat to the transatlantic community. And of course, in the strategic concept from 2022, Russia is defined as the most direct and significant threat, and that is why NATO has adopted all of its defense plans to address this threat. But it's not then defined as a long-term threat. Now, some might think that, okay, that makes it less important. Perhaps it's not direct and significant anymore. Well, it is, both, all of it, you can say. And I think for Nordic, Baltic, Poland, all of us up in Northern Europe, this is what we feel. Russia is an existential threat, just the same way as Russia wants to erase Ukraine's sovereignty. That's why they are fighting in Ukraine. That's why they are not accepting even President Trump's very benign peace deal attempts. It is an existential threat. Russia could threaten our state sovereignty. And I understand also that this might not be felt by all allies. I have myself a place in southern Spain. I know what it's like to sit there and watch, the mountains of Morocco. And of course, Russia feels very far away. It's not like when I take a dog walk by the Baltic Sea and you can sense that Russia is very close. So there is, of course, a geographic dimension to this that makes allies think a bit differently about the Russian threat. So let me just say that I think that Russia is not only a threat to us in an existential way. Russia is a systemic threat, and this is where we often make a mistake. We believe that to some countries, Russia is a direct military threat. It's a local problem. It's a local problem to Ukraine, and if there will only be a solution to Russia's military war or aggression towards Ukraine, Russia as a threat would kind of diminish, and perhaps we would not have to do all this investments in defense that we are now discussing. But I would argue against that. Russia is not a local military threat. Russia is a systemic threat in the way that Russia wants to expand its military power. It wants to expand its political power and its territory. And in that sense, the whole of Europe will be drawn into a war with Russia. This is what we are facing. And for some countries here, this is very obvious. For other countries in the NATO, it's not that obvious. But it's still worth this argument. And if we look a bit, dwell into what are the intentions of Russia, why do they want to do this, what are the capabilities and the behavior of Russia, it becomes more evident. And I think why I'm spending some time on this is that for the Nordic Baltic states, Poland, spending 3.5% on military defense as the pledge is, and an additional 1.5% on defense and security related issues, it's not a big, huge thing. Some of us already are, others have a plan for it, our public is there. This is not where the most challenges are. I think for the NATO as a whole, there is a big challenge, and that's why you need to actually think about Russia and what it is we are supposed to motivate our public with. Why is this something that we have to do either by redistributing our budgets or by lending more money or by raising taxes? It is a big thing, and therefore it is an important discussion. So if we look at Russia's intentions, they are not defined only when it comes to Ukraine. Russia wants a multipolar world order where Russia is one of the poles. That means Russia is a great power that can affect how the international system is planned and executed, and Russia can use this for its own purposes. We can see that the capabilities that Russia have is not so much in the economic sphere. Russia stated, I should say, also in the multipolar world as they see it already in 2007 in Munich, Putin did. And this is what they have been striving for. Now, some already argue that we are in a multipolar world. Others think that we are moving towards it. The point is that Russia definitely does not want to be only a regional power in Europe. It wants to be a great power on the global scene. And that is what they are aiming for. They compare themselves to the US, to China. They don't compare themselves to Germany or France or the UK. And if you look at the capabilities they have, then this doesn't work in the economic power sphere, because there Russia's power is only the size of Italy or Spain. It's dependent highly on oil and gas, and the economic power in itself does not elevate Russia from a regional power to a great power. But militarily, it compensates. The figures just came for 2024, and Russia is number 3 in the world on defense spending. After the US, after China, in real terms, Russia is number 3. And of course, they also use their nuclear power in this sense. They use it for rattling, they use it for modernizing, and they use it for being able to combine it with various other weapon systems. It also uses its alignment with China. So by aligning itself with the other bigger great power, Russia also expands its power on the global scene. China is a critical enabler for Russia's warfare in Ukraine. And they also not only work tightly together in the economic sphere, but they also practice and do operations together militarily. Not so much in Europe, but you see it more if you look up in the Arctic, on the Alaskan side, for instance. They have had joint, not only joint exercises, but also joint operations in air surveillance, for instance. And then, of course, what is very important when you talk about Russia, it's hybrid warfare, which has been ongoing now for a decade. And that spans all of Europe and the US. It spans various domains. We have seen it with sabotage. We have in the underwater cables, for instance. We have seen espionage, disinformation, election interference, cyber attacks, weaponization of migrants. Finland had to close its border. Poland is building a huge wall towards Belarus. Lithuania has severe problems. So in a range of domains, Russia is doing its hybrid warfare very efficiently, I would argue, and we are not that good at combining to see where are they doing this at the same time simultaneously in various countries and how is it hitting. And we are not targeting back either to the extent that we could actually. And then I also want to mention that in Mali, Russia pushed out France actually 2022. So they are not only active in Europe in supporting the Houthis and in advising them how to launch missiles, for instance, and their cooperation with North Korea, with soldiers fighting in the Kursk region, and now North Korea is also sending reconstruction workers to the Kursk region. Lots of munition support from North Korea to sustain Russia's war in Ukraine. So Russia does have a global outreach, global ambitions. Now, what do we need to do to counter this? I think this is important because only 5% will not take us that far. We need to see what to do with this. So if you buy into my arguments, and I think actually NATO allies have done that by what we are discussing now when it comes to Russia, is that we need to understand that NATO needs to balance against Russia, and that's long term. That's what we need to build. Internally balancing by increasing our own defense capabilities, and external balancing by aligning with other countries. Sweden and Finland joining the alliance, I think, is part of this kind of external balancing, which was very good for NATO, good for Sweden and Finland, of course, but also good for NATO, increasing NATO's overall strength and security. But I would argue that having Ukraine in NATO is also part of looking at this in this way to balance against Russia. Of course, we would be much worse off if Ukraine belonged to Russia. And for us, it's much better for European security and for our interests to have Ukraine with us, as is Moldova, as are parts of the Balkans. So we need to think about also external balancing in this way, I think, to balance against Russia. Then we will have contacts with Russia. That's not what I'm saying, but Russia is not really part of our power position, our power projection. That is how we build stability for the future, and that's how we build good conditions for future prosperity. I also think that next for NATO is to have a Russia strategy. That was a task from the Washington, D.C. summit, which was not fulfilled in The Hague. It was not possible because of the very narrow agenda that we had to have because of the new American administration. But nevertheless, we should strive to have an updated Russia strategy of how to deal with Russia as allies. I also think in more practical terms, we will need to think about what does it mean if the US withdraws and European NATO has to be a first responder to meet Russia? Because this will be coming back to the hybrid sphere, most likely a scenario where hybrid warfare from Russia will increase, and Europe needs to be ready to act first. Perhaps the US will be waiting, watching, while European NATO needs to act in the cybersphere with intel, with surveillance, reconnaissance, perhaps with drones. We don't know really, and that we also need to discuss. What does it mean for Europe to be more of a first responder towards Russia? And then finally, my final word, since it's so important, the path for Ukraine, not only to European Union membership, but also to NATO membership. We cannot put this off the agenda. We need to keep that conversation going, and that work should be ongoing. To support Ukraine is to support the future of Europe. Thank you very much, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Anna. This was great and very important here for us in Portugal to hear and to agree that Russia is waging a hybrid warfare and conducting it against all NATO allies, and the implications that this will have on a more European NATO. I will propose a slight change given the hour, and knowing that Professor Luis Simon will have to leave at 12 o'clock sharp. I will hand over the word now to him, and I would like to introduce him. Professor Luis Simon is a director of the Center for Security, Diplomacy and Strategy at the Vrije Universiteit Brussels and director of the Elcano Royals Institute Brussels office. We are a second time lucky in that Professor Simon shared the panel on key summit decisions at the NATO Public Forum with Dr. Anna Wieslander. So we look forward to hearing your take on the role of NATO's global strategic partnerships and what this means. Luis, I'll give you the floor, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Patricia. Thanks to you and to the Institute for the invite. A pleasure to share the floor again with Anna after a few days. And of course, to speak alongside my colleague and friend, Felix from Elcano, and Pedro, a pleasure to be with you as well. So just briefly, I mean, I think I would say that China and the Indo-Pacific have had, and by the way, apologies that I need to go at noon sharp. I'm sorry, really sorry about that. But so as I was saying, China and the Indo-Pacific have had a comparatively low profile at this year's NATO summit in The Hague. For instance, if you take last year's summit in Washington, the allies referred to China as the decisive enabler of Russia's war effort in Ukraine. And NATO summits have been highlighting for the past 3 years or so the increasing interdependence between the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific theaters. And we heard none of that this year, at least not in the communique, and no mention to China. Also, ever since the NATO summit in Madrid back in 2022, NATO's 4 Indo-Pacific countries, so partners, so Japan, Australia, ROK, and New Zealand, have been represented at the summit at the highest level, but not this year. So we see a bit of a gap there between the last 3-4 years of the Biden administration and this year. However, I'm not sure yet how much we should be reading into this. Because on the one hand, it's true that we see a clear push on the part of the Trump administration for European allies and for Indo-Pacific allies, by the way, to concentrate the bulk of their strategic attention and resources in their respective regions. And actually, US allies in Europe and the Indo-Pacific agree with that approach. And I would say that the main focus, and Anna already touched on that, of this summit was for Europeans to step up in Europe. But that is also partly about freeing up US strategic bandwidth and to facilitate a US rebalancing towards the Indo-Pacific, right? That's also what Secretary Hague had said. On the other hand, as long as that caveat of Europe focusing primarily on Europe is respected, I think the Trump administration seems to be open, even in favor of cooperation between NATO and its Indo-Pacific partners. In fact, Trump initially pushed for a meeting with IP4 leaders in The Hague. He's the one who actually advocated for including them there. But that eventually he had to skip that meeting. The meeting took place between the Secretary General and the partners, but not represented at the highest level, with one exception, New Zealand. And Trump eventually had to skip that meeting because he had to cut his visit short to The Hague due to the situation in the Middle East. Having said that, I think the communique in The Hague also alludes to the importance of leveraging NATO's partnerships to promote defense industrial cooperation. I think this is a clear gesture towards the Indo-Pacific, because that is actually the most, the hottest item in terms of NATO IP4 cooperation. So just to maybe to zoom out and give you some context, as you may recall, during the first visit, his first visit to NATO headquarters here in Brussels back in February, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth argued that as the United States prioritizes the deterring war with China in the Indo-Pacific, Europeans will need to lead from the front in Europe, and we Americans and Europeans should aim for a division of labor, and I'm quoting, that maximizes our comparative advantages in Europe and the Pacific. So essentially saying that Europeans should focus primarily on the Indo-Pacific and on Europe, and the United States primarily on the Indo-Pacific. And I think that kind of thinking, of course, clashes with what we've been hearing from the Biden administration for the past 4 years. So I would say that it's clear that the Biden and Trump two administrations feature different perspectives on how Indo-Pacific and Euro-Atlantic dynamics intersect, in the sense that Biden, for instance, underscored the need to defend global norms whenever and wherever they were challenged, and saw the challenge to Ukraine as a broader challenge that could be extrapolated to a Taiwan challenge. So it was sort of like a global normative challenge. He also treated Russia and China as a coherent bloc, and also fostered cross-regional cooperation between US allies in the Euro-Atlantic and Indo-Pacific, whereas Trump appears to be challenging every one of these premises, right? So far, he's emphasized the need to establish a clear ranking of priorities with China, and more specifically, the China threat in the Indo-Pacific, and not China as a global challenge, but the China threat in the Indo-Pacific coming first and everything else being secondary or even superfluous. And Trump also appears to be rejecting the logic of treating China and Russia as a coherent bloc. And then again, finally, it seems unclear to what extent or how far he wants to go in terms of promoting cooperation between NATO and the Indo-Pacific, between US allies in both regions. Having said that, I would highlight that there are two very important, even critical matters on which the Biden and Trump administrations seem to agree upon. The first is the notion that strategic competition, or great power competition, because they use different terms, and more specifically competition with China, stands out as America's overriding national security priority. And the second and related point has to do with the fact that insofar as Trump's strategic approach towards Ukraine and Europe appears to be significantly informed by China and Indo-Pacific related considerations, meaning we need to reduce here so that we can beef up there, then we can also safely argue that both administrations operate under the assumption that there's a high degree of strategic interdependence between the Euro-Atlantic and the Indo-Pacific. The question is how you conceptualize that interdependence and how you manage it. But they agree on the fact that they are interdependent. But I also would say, maybe to wrap up, that there's an area, there's the potential for convergence. And I think we may be approaching that point as far as the NATO's Indo-Pacific agenda goes. I would argue that the future of NATO's Indo-Pacific agenda, beyond The Hague, hinges on the ability to reconcile two seemingly contradictory pressures. On the one hand, NATO and its Indo-Pacific partners must think about how their cooperation can add value in the context of competition with China, which seems to be the Trump administration's and particularly the Pentagon's main priority. And on the other hand, they must ensure that their cooperation does not detract from what must be their overriding priority, which means shoring up deterrence in their respective regions. And I think there's a way to square that, which is precisely what I mentioned at the outset, which is defense industrial cooperation. Defense industrial, but also more broadly capability development, standards, doctrines, and so on. So, because ultimately, we at NATO and US Indo-Pacific allies over there face a remarkably similar conceptual and operational problem, namely how to implement deterrence by denial in our home regions. And that means that we need similar sets of concepts, capabilities, defense industrial solutions, technological solutions, and standards. So if we can come up with a sort of cross-theater ecosystem of shared concepts, doctrines, capabilities, technologies, and standards that bolsters deterrence by denial and respects the principle of prioritization, we can still remain separate operationally and each in our respective operational corners, but leverage our synergies to basically generate gains in terms of efficiency, scale, speed of delivery, in terms of systems and so on and so forth, which, by the way, are top priorities for the current U.S. Department of Defense. So it would be like a Doge in a global sense. So I think there's space for the Biden and Trump administration to converge around this agenda, and I think this is something that both European allies and Indo-Pacific allies are likely to be interested in. I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Many thanks for this, Luis, and for pointing out that even though the Indo-Pacific wasn't that much present, that it wasn't mentioned in the communique as China was not, that there is definitely an independence which is probably increasing between the two theaters, between the two regions, and that in fact defining strategies on how to implement deterrence by denial in the respective regions, in our home regions, is absolutely crucial. And the point is taken that there is this convergence between different US administrations, that clearly China has become the priority for the US strategic posture in the region of the Indo-Pacific. And now taking a geographical turn back to the Euro-Atlantic area, but this time to the southwestern dimension, we will have our next two speakers focus on Portugal and Spain. We will start with Professor Pedro Seabra, whom I'll introduce briefly. He is Assistant Professor at ISCTE University Institute of Lisbon and Deputy Director of the Center for International Studies. And again, for the third term, Pedro was also present at the NATO Public Forum, so he will also have insights to share, hopefully. So Pedro, the floor is yours, and we look forward to hearing your take on how Portugal has viewed this summit. Thanks very much. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Patricia, for that kind introduction and of course, for the invitation to this panel. And thank you as well to the National Defense Institute for organizing this event. Clearly, we have still a lot to unpack regarding the post-summit, which makes this panel and the participation of my fellow colleagues extremely timely. So what I think I will be doing in the next couple of minutes is to center around 3 areas. So I'll make some initial considerations on the summit itself, and I'll try and pivot to the Portuguese case. And then lastly, I will zoom in a bit on the issue of the southern flank, which I believe warrants some attention of its own. So first things first, and after all is said and done, and we've heard quite a lot about it already, what is the actual outcome from this particular summit? We have heard plenty already, but I don't think we have yet paid particular attention or enough attention to some of those outcomes. Yes, Trump got his key wishes. Yes, the declaration was brought down to a bare minimum, and it has skirted away any other possible controversies. And yes, the alliance has survived yet another big gathering to tell the story another day. But I think there's another 2 points that need to be highlighted here. And the first one is that what we need to keep as the ballpark at the end of the day is the 3.5%. That's the key figure that will matter, and that's the one that will have the more direct consequences in terms of new military spending and investment. And I recall very vividly during NATO's public forum, Belgium's defense minister, I believe, who was very adamant on this point, and even corrected some people who were having a hard time grasping at the magnitude of the big 5%. No, what countries really need to focus on is on meeting the 3.5%. Mind you, of course, reaching this is no less feat on its own and will still involve mind-numbing amounts for most allies. But I think at the very least, it is a number far more realistic to plan around, to talk about, than relying on the 5% as the main target. My second point is that as a consequence of that acknowledgement, we now know what can figure within the other remaining 1.5% that we have seen in the headlines, namely everything and then some. And in fact, I think in the coming days and months, we will hear plenty of stories on sudden reclassifications of equipment and infrastructures in order to fit the bill. And I think if examples were needed, I would refer you to the news yesterday over Italy and its plans on building a 13.2 billion euro bridge to Sicily and its intents or its plans to report it as such to NATO. So this tells us that there is, I think, incredible leeway, incredible flexibility to meet these targets, which also begs the question of why we needed to formally have an agreement as such in the first place. And we know, of course, the answer to that, and we know whom we had to cater to. However, yes, it was largely performative. Yes, it was largely artificial. And yes, everyone agreed on kicking the can down the road to 2035, much like what they did in Wales in 2014 in concerning 2024. But it doesn't mean that something good can't come out of it. And I will try and circle back to this point at the end of my remarks. So where does Portugal stand amidst it all? And I think there's a couple of ideas that I can bring up here today. First, even though belonging to the group of the so-called lax spenders, Portugal was not necessarily the bête noire of the ball, so to speak, unlike Spain, and I'm sure Felix will cover this, nor was it particularly singled out in the process leading up to the summit. The numbers are well known. And officials have been very upfront about the 1.55% that was reached last year, which did not meet the 2% that had been previously agreed upon. Second, it is also public that the Portuguese government issued a full commitment to reach that 2% by the end of this year, as well as the 3.5 plus 1.5 by 2035. Much like with other countries, I think the details are a bit scarce yet, but it has already been floated around a couple of options in order to reach those goals. And I think at the end of the day, the country will probably resort to a similar playbook as other European countries. And that playbook will probably be a mix of reclassifying expenditure as dual use, which will make it admissible under NATO's criteria, making good use of SAFE and other EU-funded mechanisms that are being enrolled as we speak, finding cross-sectoral opportunities that might contribute to Portugal's efforts towards international security, And I believe I saw this last Sunday, a communique from this government mentioning that the country's ongoing candidacy for a non-permanent seat at the UN Security Council, for example, would be included as part of those figures. And lastly, of course, seeking out new industrial opportunities that might allow to produce and sell military equipment to other partners and allies, and therefore include such revenue within the much talked about metrics. And for those bookies at home that will be counting down decimal places, I wish you good luck in trying to disentangle it all in the coming years. And be that with regard to Portugal or any other country in this situation. But regardless, what should matter here is how much Portugal will be able to match these efforts to its own national priorities concerning NATO. And I think in that context, a traditional one, not the only one for sure, but a traditional one in particular, did not fare that well at The Hague, amongst many other priorities that other allies also did not get in. And that is, of course, the issue of the southern flank. And this flank, it includes, for all intended purposes, North Africa, the Middle East, as well as the Sahel and Sub-Saharan Africa. So it's a very big and broad scenario, right? With a lot of different variables in there. And in that regard, I think at a public forum, we actually heard the Secretary General offering plenty of praises to Portugal, Spain, France, and Italy for leading the charge 2 years ago when they pushed for an internal debate on where the organization should go and what it should do regarding this particular geographic scenario. And as most of you probably know, this resulted in the adoption in 2024 during the Washington Summit of the Southern Neighborhood Action Plan, which comprised a practical roadmap, so to speak, to foster better and bigger engagement with many of NATO's partners in those regions. However, I think someone once said that we should never underestimate NATO's ability to paper over internal differences. Well, I think we should also never underestimate NATO's ability to jump through priorities from one summit to the other. And right now, I think it's very difficult to make the case that the southern flank matters in the grand scheme of things. Any talk of a 360-degree approach, I believe, falls flat for all intended purposes. And we know that it is all hands on deck with the eastern flank, rightly so, and with appeasing the Trump administration during the summit. But I think we also know there is a larger problem in terms of the approach towards the South. And I think there are 3 elements here that are allowed to corroborate this. First, the office of the Special Representative for the South, which was created last year, remains understaffed and is being affected by the organizational cuts and downsizes that the Secretary General is imprinting on the organization. Secondly, the promises of sustained or renewed high-level political dialogue with Southern partners are nowhere to be seen. And lastly, the extensive set of goals in the action plan that was approved last year have been quietly shoved away and lost any semblance of political cover from most of the allies' leaderships. So some still held hopes of talking about the southern flank due to the Israeli-US attacks on Iran's nuclear facilities, but the fact was it had been mostly resolved by the time the leaders gathered at The Hague. And maybe it is indeed just a problem of bad timing, and I can concede on that, of the southern flank being trampled on by more pressing outcomes. But does this mean, or does this signal to us that the threat level in the South has abated? Does it mean that it has become a minor flank for the alliance? Far from it, in my opinion. Stately instability, terrorism, geopolitical competition, it all remains as relevant and as perilous for the alliance as 1 year ago, if not even more. So what it means is that in as much as accountants throughout the allied countries, we also need to become a bit more creative in talking about the South, just in order to ensure that is not pulled indefinitely from the center of our focus. And as some concluding remarks, I would just suggest 3 what I think are feasible, even if minimal, developments that we could expect to see in this regard. The first one is that the 1.5% target that we talked about could potentially include a discussion over the protection of critical maritime infrastructure that connects the European continent to its southern neighborhood. And even if developments will be more likely driven by what happens in the Baltic, like Anna mentioned, rather than by what happens in the Mediterranean or in the Gulf of Guinea, I think there's still room to explore here, which would in turn help the discussion move forward. Secondly, NATO's defense capacity building packages, the DCBs, have done miracles in recent years, considering the meager resources that allies have made available to them. They are not very flashy, they are not easy to promote, but they do instill much needed confidence among partner countries. And I think with a little investment from allies, especially from those who have steadily supported this approach, I think they could at least fill in a hole until a new political focus is brought back on. And lastly, my third point involves us looking ahead into 2026 and who will be hosting next NATO summit, which will be Turkey. I know we are still feeling a bit of whiplash from The Hague, but I think Istanbul is just around the corner, and this could easily become yet another opportunity to put the southern flank back on the agenda, even if we should also be ready to test the limits of what that south should look like, or what it should extend into. So just to conclude and bringing us back to the much maligned metrics and targets, even though they are, again, largely performative, even though they are largely artificial, even though we've pushed back the deadline the farthest we could, I think they still remain a one-of-a-kind opportunity to build something up. So one can only hope that amidst it all, allies are able, at the very least, to spare a dime for the south and the southern flank. And I will leave it at that. Thank you.
Thanks, Pedro. And thank you for pointing out the need for NATO to act on the southern flank strategy that it adopted last year, as you mentioned, meaning that the strategy was adopted while the Ukraine war has been raging on at that time for 2 years. So that shouldn't be the reason why the southern flank, in fact, does not stand more prominently in NATO's current approach and strategy. And remaining in the southwestern region, I will now hand over the floor to our last speaker today, and I'm pleased to introduce Dr. Felix Arteaga, who is Senior Fellow at the Elcano Royal Institute in Madrid and who has worked as a Senior Analyst at the International Affairs and Foreign Policy Institute in INCIPE. Felix, I hand over to you, and we are, of course, very interested to hear about Spain's special position adopted at the summit regarding the 5% defense pledge. Over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here surrounded by friends and colleagues. I like to use the Spanish experience in the summit. As you know, Spain has showed some difficulties to follow the general trend, mainly by domestic politics, but in the background, there may be some lessons learned from the Spanish experience. As you know, Spain rejected the need for 5%. This is something that Spain justified because of the difficulty to explain public opinion the metrics of the 5%. Why not 6 or why not 4%? And that is something that NATO should take into account in the future, because there is a lack of transparency about the final aim. For instance, the Spanish president made mention that according to Spanish metrics, we only need 2.1% of the GDP to cope with the NATO's tactical operational goals. And the problem for those who are outsiders to the organizations is that neither the European, the NATO planning, nor the Spanish planning are available for comparison. They are almost secret, and it's very difficult to plan. And in the future, and I agree with this, in this case with my president, it's going to be very difficult to explain our public opinions that we will have to make a bigger effort if we cannot explain what for. And that's something NATO should take into account for the future. We have to define capability target. I'm not asking for everything should be open, but a higher level of transparency will help to reinforce strategic communication. Second, our president, Spain, also introduced the need for a non-single chapter on defense, on core defense issue, but trying to justify better spending on a greater scope of chapters, defense, security, and this is according to the NATO resilience policy and posture, because now NATO allied member states have not only to deal with the defense core issue, but also with resilience issues. And that, as Pedro said before, has to do with critical infrastructure protection in south, north, wherever. It has to do with hybrid warfare, with disinformation, and we need money for that. And of course, there are some countries which are devoting money for this, but not all of them. And we have to make room for new expenditure chapters. So I don't agree with Pedro about the less need for 1.5% because it's going to be, for instance, one of the debates within the Hague summit was about devoting the financial and military aid to Ukraine in one or another chapter, and that could change the difference between one another. So a second element of discussion for me is, well, if all agreed that a so-called European pillar is going to replace the American one in the long term, why don't we proceed to planify the replacement, the transfer of authorities, equipment, and so forth in a different manner, and not waiting for a sudden withdrawal of American equipment. We have to planify not only for the American troops, but also for strategic enablers. We need time to replace them, and we need to planify in advance. And that means that we should talk about more how to develop this time a real European defense pillar, because otherwise it's very difficult to say. And regarding the NATO challenges, we all agree as well on the need for common defense equipment and industrial cooperation, but we are not able to define those common public defense goods, neither at NATO nor at the European Union. We don't have that list yet in front of us, and that is very difficult to organize industrial cooperation arrangement if we don't have something like a list of priorities to deliver. And that is something really difficult. Another difficulty, another challenge for the future is about the strategic communication. Anne rightly said that the threat perception in the northern countries and the southern one is different. But what is different maybe the lack of southern leadership in leading the population in supporting those now and here under Soviet direct military threat. And that is something that I haven't seen in my own country. We talk a lot about Russia, but as all you know, there are many new graphics measuring the GDP against the distance to Russian borders. And that puts Italy, France, Spain, and Portugal at the end of the graphic. So we need more strategic communication. We need more solidarity. But it is up to the political leaders to show that solidarity. Finally, I envy our northern colleagues because they are able first to conceptualize the northern threat. Of course, it's easier because Russia is there, and it's easier to see Russia in the Baltic, in the north, in the Arctic, than seeing Russia in the south. But neither Italy, France, or Portugal or Spain have been able to develop a common threat concept, a common joint military unit or initiative. We have done almost nothing. And we spend time blaming NATO and the rest of the allies because the Southern Regional Plan is not visible, tangible enough. But really, in fact, we are doing very little for our own societies. Of course, we cannot expect NATO to solve our problems and to deal with the southern Western threat. But we need first to consolidate our groupings, our unilateral arrangements. I miss any Southern European framework nation unit or something like that. And that could help a lot. We have to think about what we can do to defend the NATO against the southern trend, and not only the opposite. I'll stop here.
Thank you very much, Felix. That was also very eye-opening, especially your last point in saying that maybe because the southern flank threats are so multiple, this means or this makes more difficult a cooperation between the southern European NATO member countries and NATO as a whole. Unfortunately, Professor Luis Simon had to leave us by now, but we will open up the questions now, and we do hope that Anna and Felix are able to stay with us for just a few more minutes. I see Anna nodding. I hope Felix as well. We'll try to speed up the questions. There is one question regarding for Professor Pedro Seabra. For Pedro, there's one question regarding the importance of the island of Terceira, the Azores island of Terceira. How do you see the importance of the Terceira island for NATO in the next 10 years? And for Anna, there's a question regarding how, and I agree with this question in terms of how do you convince, and Felix was just talking about the importance of political will and political leadership. what recommendation would you give to the Southern European and NATO member countries on how to bring their public opinions on board? I think this is absolutely crucial. We are looking at the next 5 to 10 years where we have to follow up on this defense investment to reach the 5% defense pledge. How do we best conduct political leadership in terms of having public opinion engaged to the extent that they will accept that this will be done and will be financed either by new investments directly or by contracting new debt or by cutting in other sectors. And to Felix, finally, my question would be regarding Spain's position at the summit. Do you think that there is a possibility that maybe other member countries of the alliance might either resent Spain for the position it took, or maybe even in the short term try to emulate it in terms of indirectly this way contributing to less unity within NATO's strategic priorities? And I'll hand over to Pedro, then Anna, then Felix. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Patricia, and thank you for that question. Yes, I think it is always something to keep in the back of our minds, right? Making the best of what we have right now in terms of strategic locations, in terms of strategic infrastructures, and of course, historically in the Azores has always been very high on that list. I seem to recall that, of course, there's been NATO investments in terms of the pier in Ponta Delgada to anchor NATO submarines, for example. And I think that in the context of seeing this emphasis on new metrics and targets, and of course having all the allies building up their own increasing their own expenditures. I think, and I agree in this point, what Felix said at the end, I think we'll have to see more of the allies themselves coming up with alternatives to help supplement some of the parts or some of the issues in which the alliance as a whole is not able to provide right now. And of course, in terms of anti-submarine warfare and everything that has to do with capabilities that we still need in order to patrol and to provide surveillance within the broader Atlantic, I think that would be very much welcomed. And I'm pretty sure that would be always something to look for. However, the history of the Azores and the history of NATO's involvement with it, it also shows us that we have to be a bit careful in terms of expecting too much too fast. And therefore, I would take this with a grain of salt and hope certainly for some developments in that front, but without expecting something in the near short term. Basically a cop-out, I understand, but still.
About how the NATO allies will implement the new agreement. One of the lessons learned from the current system is that there must be fixed criteria. NATO should fix the criteria. The implementation of the criteria could be flexible according to the circumstances, but criteria must be fixed. For instance, our government has trying to artificially increase the chapter, the items included to match NATO metrics. And from NATO, the Spanish public opinion neighbor received a statement saying, yes, your proposal of military expenditure is according or not to our figures. The implementation system must be not only fixed, but also public in many ways. The problem for the public opinion is that they ignore if the money they transfer to the government is being assigned on the agreed goals or not. And if the public opinion has no public statement from NATO or on the European Union say, okay, you are your military expenditure is according to, is matching our criteria, and then your country right is implementing that with the suspicion about the last effectiveness of military expansion will grow with the time. So we have to define within NATO now the new metrics, what new items should be included, what should be excluded from one chapter to 3.5% or the other. But we have to be more proactive in defining for public communication, and that's all. That is a responsibility for the future.
Anna, please. Over to you.
Thank you. Yes, excellent question. Well, I agree with Felix. I think this the transparency issue is important. I mean, I'm not a politician, but I follow political dialogue on this throughout Europe quite extensively. And I think one important thing is to talk more about, we need to talk a lot about this, how to motivate the public and how to explain this. This is one point, much more than we would do today. And I think just to explain also that defense and deterrence is like a platform that you build future economic prosperity upon in the world that we live in today. It's not economic sphere and defense sphere. They are not separate. I mean, it's a shift where defense and deterrence really makes it possible to build prosperity in the future. I think that's one important point, because all of this is threatened. Our system of market economy, our system of democracy, our system of the rule of law. And then the threats will vary. I think, I mean, the Russian threat perhaps is more of a story in the north than it is in the south. But as I said in my introduction, I also think there is a story of Russia in the south, through its hybrid warfare, through its global ambitions. So we are so interdependent, so interconnected in Europe that it's not a sphere. Everyone is a frontline state. That's what Rutte said. And perhaps that's a bit, strong words, but in a way, I think he has a point there, that we all will be dragged into Russia's ambitions if we don't stop them by increasing deterrence. So then I think there are a couple of other things that politicians should pay more attention to. I think not to have a gap between civilians or the public and the elite. In Sweden, we have something we call a whole of society approach, in Finland as well, total defense. It means that every citizen is actually by law involved in defending or the country. And you perhaps don't need to take it that far, but everyone should be involved in preparedness, for instance. That has also to do with severe crisis in peacetime. It could be, nature conditions or whatever. But lockdown like Spain, Portugal had on was it electricity some month ago, things like that, where you need to involve everyone also practically in preparedness. And I think that also changes the mindset and puts these issues more at hand, so that you talk about these issues more. When you open a newspaper or a TV show or listen to a radio program on the news, there should be something on preparedness, on the threats, on military defense needs, quite often, in order to keep this up front in people's mind and to make them understand and connect the dots. So there is a lot to do on the communication side here, definitely. There are lots of good stories, arguments, but we are not doing enough.
Thank you very much, Anna. And looking at the time, we will have to unfortunately wrap up here. I thank all the speakers very much. I think you've touched upon many issues that NATO in the coming, looking ahead, will have to deal with. I think particularly this last point about public opinion and this also bottom-up approach is one area where the North and the South definitely can cooperate much more. And like you all mentioned, and like we all know, hybrid warfare affects us all. It doesn't make a geographical difference. So in terms of the civil preparedness, and I think basically the question of explaining and engaging with public opinion is something which has to go alongside with political leadership. And we've seen that that is in a way possible. It just depends very much on the political will and also on societies being able to support this civil preparedness and to engage public opinion, to realize that what we're facing now as European NATO is in fact a different geopolitical landscape where the United States is in fact disengaging from the security and defense of Europe. We don't know yet to what extent. The US global force posture is under review. We will hear about it later this year. It was announced that this withdrawal, partial troop withdrawal, will occur in a coordinated manner, but regardless of the amount of troops that might be withdrawn, what we as Europeans definitely know is that we urgently have to do much more to contribute to our own national defense, but obviously also to the collective defense of NATO and hereby contribute to the deterrence of the whole Euro-Atlantic area. I want to thank our 7 speakers. Luis Simon is no longer here, unfortunately, but I want to thank each one of you very much for participating in this webinar of the National Defense Institute. We thank you very much for your time, for your interest. We also would like to thank the audience for being such an engaging audience, and we wish you all either a successful working week or for those who go on holiday, a lovely summer holiday, and hope to see you sometime soon. Thank you very much and stay safe.
Thank you.